This lesson is on the Crusades and the plagues, and this is part 3 of a 3-part series on Western Europe in the post-classical period. So I want to start with the First Crusade. 1095, Pope Urban II calls for a crusade to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. Urban had grown frustrated with the power of the kings and the decreasing power of the church. And he also saw the lands of the church, all the kingdoms of Europe, starting to become very fragmented and to fight against one another. And he saw this as a way to unite his people. And this is a very old strategy in human history. Kings and popes and rulers and emperors have always known that if your people are fighting too much with each other, that finding a common enemy and going to war is a great way to get people to work together and unify. Right? And so one of his promises was that these crusaders would have their sins forgiven if they fought for God. So this was a holy war, right? I mean, as modern Americans, we often think of this idea of jihad in Islam as this holy war. It's not exactly what jihad is in Islam, but the term in American English has taken hold. That if you fight for God, you'll be rewarded. And Americans always point to Islam as having this problem, and I usually point back and say, Christianity has had this within its history as well. This is a human thing, right? I mean, I talk about this all the time in class, right? These aren't Christian or Muslim or European or African or Chinese things. These are human things, which is one of the things I want you to learn from this course. Right. This also was seen by, these knights who are lower level nobility as an opportunity to gain land and wealth. If they went over there and conquered land, they could become landed nobility in ways that they couldn't back home in Europe. So, these knights saw it as an opportunity in the same way the church did. Now, I talked about the First Crusade, but there were really 4 of them. Even then, it's kind of hard to break them down. I mean, these movements of soldiers and navies out of various parts of Europe into the Holy Land, but it all converges here on Jerusalem, right? The holy city of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, modern-day Israel. And so, you have all these troops going through, and they had a big impact on, various groups of people, notably the Seljuk Turks, the Byzantines, the Italians. This is the peninsula of Italy right here. For the Italians, this increased trade and connection. For the Byzantines, this was pretty harmful. Those Crusaders did some real damage within the Byzantine lands, and then conflicts with the Seljuk Turks were inflamed, again, because of all these soldiers going through their land. So, this had a big impact on the region. I talked earlier about this having a very limited impact on Islam and the Islamic empires as a whole. But locally, this was a big deal, as we're going to see in our DBQ. And in the First Crusade, the Crusaders were victorious, and they set up what they called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And this lasted from 1099 to 1291, although it was defeated by the very famous Muslim general Saladin in 1187. If you've ever seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, which is one of my favorites, that recreates the battles that led to the downfall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187, although Crusaders were able to reestablish what they called the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the city of Acre in 1192, and that's what lasted until 1291. Acre here is in the north. It's not Jerusalem at all, but that didn't stop the Crusaders from calling it that. And so as I've said before, the Crusades had a big impact on Europe. Not as much of an impact on the Abbasid Dynasty, whose power was much further east in Baghdad, and whose power base was made up of Persians and Central Asians and people from the eastern part of the empire. But it did achieve the goal that the Pope set of unifying European kingdoms. And the Europeans learned a lot from the Muslims and brought back a lot of goods and ideas, right? And this connects back to the impact of Islamic civilization DBQ that we did a little while ago. Or if you're listening to this next year, we'll do this perhaps now. you know, the learning and sophistication of the Arabs was brought back by these Crusaders into Europe and had very beneficial effects on the Europeans. But it did, as I've said before, strain relationships with the Byzantines and damaged many of their trade routes and cities. In some ways, you know, the Byzantines were more hurt by their own European Christian friends than they were by Arab Muslims from the East. And part of this increased connection, and this is also a byproduct of trade, was the Black Death. I mean, this whole lesson's about, you know, some of the bad things that happened to Europe in this time period, and it doesn't get much worse than the Black Death, right? Caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, I believe is how that's pronounced, that causes the blood vessels to break, and it often caused bleeding underneath the skin. You know, the buboes, as they're called, bubonic plague. I mean, these are literally pockets of blood underneath the skin, very often out at the fingertips or under the rib cage or in the groin. A lot of it has to do with the lymph nodes. And it's just a nasty disease, as you can see here. I mean, it looks like this flesh is literally rotting while the person's still alive. Now, Yersinia pestis is usually caused by rats. I mean, it's still out there in the world. It doesn't really affect Americans very much as long as they stay in America. Sometimes it's caught by Americans who go overseas, but it's carried by rats. And the current theory is that it was brought either by Mongol invaders or by international trade from East Asia. This is still a point of debate within world history, but what we know is almost certainly caused by long-distance trade and connections within the world network, whether it's the Mongols trading and invading, or ships coming through the waterways, or, you know, traders coming along the Silk Roads. You know, it's a product of long-distance trade, which is something to keep in mind, because this is a big topic in 20th century history as we look at things like swine flu, avian flu, SARS, AIDS, Ebola. You know, these are all diseases that are much more rampant now because you have people flying all over the world all the time. This little animated GIF here shows you the expansion of the Black Death and how much of Europe was affected by this in a very short period, right? In less than 10 years, pretty much all of Europe, except for a few mountainous regions, are subject to the Black Plague. And it had a horrible effect on Europe. You know, killed between 50 and 75 million people over the course of 100 years. This is something like 30% of Europe's population. Right? I mean, so what that, if you want to imagine what that looks like, you know, line up with two of your friends, you know, one of you is going to die, or line up 10 people and 3 of you are going to die, or in a normal high school classroom, that means 10 of you are gone, right? And so some of the other effects of that, though, is that it raised the value of labor. Suddenly there were much less workers available, and because there were less workers, the value of their work went up. And this actually had an interesting benefit. I mean, we don't usually talk about mass disease like this as being a good thing, but in many cases, serfs were freed. Peasants found themselves with more money and lower rents because they could command a higher value for their labor. So it's kind of an interesting change here. It also had a big impact on European Christianity at this time period. I mean, people literally thought the world was ending. They thought this was the apocalypse and the end of the world, and God's wrath was upon them for the wicked things they'd done. And so both the changes in the value of labor, the increased rights of the lower classes, and the increased religious emphasis, you know, had some real big impacts on the social structure, as you can imagine. And over time, you know, feudalism started to decline, you know, and so this, you know, is bringing us towards the end of this period of Western European history. You know, the feudal and manorial model was starting to decline. Part of this was because of STEM imbalances and rebalances. When workers could produce more food on their own, changes in population, changes in merchant class, changes in urbanization, you know, that made some people wealthy and some people poorer, and that's all because of technology. Also, we see the decreasing power of mounted knights. in the medieval period and even back to the Dark Ages, a guy on a horse is going to win most every time, particularly if he has armor, right? And the only people who have armor and horses are rich people. But once the crossbow and the longbow become a part of European warfare, suddenly those knights just aren't that powerful. You can have a peasant with a crossbow kill a high-class knight with very sophisticated weapons from 100 yards away. So suddenly these knights aren't so upper class after all, because they can be wiped out very easily in battle. Also, increasing siege weapons shifted the warfare away from castles. And so again, rich knights with big castles just really weren't that safe and powerful anymore. And the big change is, of course, gunpowder, right? Once cannons and what were kind of called hand cannons, I wouldn't even call them rifles at that point. Again, the knights just weren't that strong anymore, especially against cannons, and neither were their castles. And so we see a growing power of peasants over landlords. And thinking back to the Magna Carta and the increasing influence of parliaments, vassals and landlords are starting to have more power over kings as well. And so this is another thing that just shifts Europe towards democracy. It's kind of power to the lower class people. And so the long-range implications of this, and this kind of connects to that topic and that question that I've asked you before of how Europe became so powerful in such a short period of time, right? Because at the beginning of period 3 of world history, Western Europe was pretty poor and very backwards, especially in terms of like science and knowledge and learning, right? But they created institutions and structures that would make the continent very wealthy and progressive, right? The freedom of the merchants, the unity of the church, the growing democracy and power of the people. And also, Europe was just lucky. And I've talked about this before, how some civilizations are just in a lucky geographic position, right? Western Europe is at the end of the Silk Road, and so it's learning so much from these older civilizations, but it's also in a great place to connect with the New World. So it's right on those crossroads, and I've talked about that in our geography lessons as well. Being at the crossroads where civilizations mix is often a place to become very wealthy and very powerful. And so those Western European powers, right, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Germans, the Dutch, they're going to start to rule the world in period 4 of world history. So we want to keep in mind some of these long-range implications, right? And this goes also back to what we read in class, Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, right? I mean, because the world is just now coming out of 5 centuries of Western European domination. Huntington's aware of that, and America is increasingly aware of that as we look towards China and our changing relationship with, East Asia. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.